in the last class on Sidney's apology, we saw that Sidney compared poetry to four disciplines: philosophy, history, theology and law. Now, you may know that after the trivium, that is grammar, logic and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, that is geometry, astronomy, music and arithmetic, which were the principal subjects of study in school. After the study of these 7 subjects, for higher education, the subjects available were theology, philosophy, law and history. So, in comparing poetry to these subjects, Sidney has covered the entire syllabus of the medieval school curriculum. So, Sidney says that we finished where Sidney was talking about law, and says that law is the daughter of justice, jus is the daughter of justice, and justice the chief of the virtues. Yet, because he seeketh to make men good, rather formidene poene, that is, justice tries to make men good by the fear of punishment, formidene poene, than virtutis amore, or simple love of virtue. Then Sidney says that and these four are all that anyway deal in that consideration of men's manners, which being the supreme knowledge, they that best read it deserve the best commendation. So you see how highly Sidney praises manners of men, that is, manners of men, how they deal with others, their ethical behavior. Sidney calls it the supreme knowledge. So not simply the knowledge from books or the knowledge gained, by studies, but knowledge as applied to life, as applied to others, the ethical conduct towards others. And says that those who breed them, that is, those who cultivate these manners, they should be praised the highest. They deserve highest commendation, that is praise. Then he goes on to talk about the defects of philosophy and history. The philosopher therefore and the historian are they which would win the goal, the one by precept, the other by example. The philosopher teaches by the precept, that is theory of ethical behavior, and the historian teaches by example, that is by citing examples from history of great men. But both, not having both, do both halt. That is, neither of them take into consideration both theory and practice. One teaches theory and the other only cites practice, therefore both of them are lacking. For the philosopher setting down with thorny argument the bare rule is so hard of utterance and so misty to be conceived, that one that hath no other guide but him shall wait in him till he be old, before he shall find sufficient cause to be honest. He says that the philosopher teaches dry theory, dry precept, with which he calls a thorny argument. Most probably he has in his mind the medieval arguments or disputations of the philosophers, and he speaks in a difficult manner, misty to be conceived, that is, his speech is difficult to be understood, so that a man would grow very old before he can learn honesty from philosophy or learn any virtue from philosophy. For his knowledge standeth so upon the abstract and general, that happy is that man who may understand him, and more happy that can apply what he doth understand. So abstract and generalized conceptualization by philosophy is difficult to follow. So people do not understand and therefore do not learn. On the other side, the historian wanting the precept is so tied not to what should be but to what is, the particular truth of these things, and not to the general reason of things, that his example draweth no necessary consequence and therefore a less fruitful doctrine. The historian, on the other hand, does not teach any theory at all, but he is tied to facts, what is, and by merely citing facts, what is there, he is unable to teach anything of consequence to people because particular truth of things, they do not have any universal application, and therefore people hardly learn much from the examples of history. His purpose, of course, is to indicate how poetry surpasses both history and philosophy in teaching people ethical conduct or moral virtue. Now, does the peerless poet perform both? That is, both in theory and practice. For whatsoever the philosopher saith should be done, he giveth a perfect picture of it in someone by whom he presupposeth it was done. So poetry invents examples who perfectly embody moral virtues. A perfect picture, I say, for he yieldeth to the powers of the mind an image of that whereof the philosopher bestoweth but a wordish description. The philosopher only gives us the theoretical description, but which Sidney calls wordish. But the poet, by creating an example which is very much alive or is similar to living qualities of a person, the poet gives the readers much more interesting example to follow. For as in outward things, to a man that had never seen an elephant or a rhinoceros, who should tell him most exquisitely all their shapes, colour, bigness, and particular marks? Or of a gorgeous palace, the architecture, with declaring the full beauties, might well make the hearer able to repeat, as it were, by rote all he had heard, yet should never satisfy his inward conceits with being witness to itself of a true lively knowledge. But the same man, as soon as he might see those beasts well painted or the house well in model, should straightway grow without need of any description to a judicial comprehending of them. So, no doubt the philosopher, with his learned definitions, be it of virtue, vices, matters of public policy or private government, replenisheth the memory with many infallible grounds of wisdom, which notwithstanding lie dark below the imaginative and judging power, if they be not illuminated or figured forth by the speaking picture of poesy. So Sidney says that if somebody hears only a description of a rhinoceros or an exotic elephant, exotic animal like an elephant or a rhinoceros, but has never seen it or seen any picture of it, or if one hears the description of an architectural marvel, a great palace, but until he sees it or sees an image of it, he cannot understand it. Therefore, the importance of image on the mind for conceiving anything is very high, very great. So Sidney says that philosopher talks about vices, virtues, public policy, and so on and so forth on moral philosophy, but the reader cannot imagine them, because until they see any image of such qualities, and the poet presents characters who bear these qualities and who are very lifelike, and therefore immediately by reading poetry one would understand the virtues which are being praised and which should be emulated. Truly taketh much pains and many times not without poetical helps to make us know the force of love of our country hath in has. Truly means Cicero. The Renaissance writers mostly refer to Cicero as Tully, and says that Cicero in his writings often writes about patriotism or love of one's country, but that is mere theoretical discussion. On the other hand, poets give us great pictures of characters who are patriotic, who love their country. For example, old Anchises speaking in the midst of Troy's flames, or Ulysses in the fullness of all Calypso's delights bewail his absence from barren and beggarly Ithaca. So these pictures remain in one's mind if one has ever read them. And the example of anger, the Stoics said was a short madness. Let but Sophocles bring you Ajax on a stage, killing or whipping sheep and oxen, thinking them the army of Greeks with their chieftains, Agamemnon and Menelaus. So, if the Trojan character Ajax is represented dramatically whipping his sheep, imagining them to be the Greek generals or soldiers, then one would understand what is anger immediately. So Sidney's point here is that poetry is a speaking picture, a very interesting phrase, and it figures forth something. So any idea is fleshed out by poetry in a figure or in a picture, and a speaking picture, because poetry is also made of words, but with words poetry creates pictures that impress us much more suitably than the description by a philosopher. See whether wisdom and temperance in Ulysses and Diomedes, valor in Achilles, friendship in Nisus and Euryalus, even to an ignorant man carry not an apparent shining. So he gives some examples from Greek and Roman literature of such qualities like wisdom, temperance. These qualities were highly praised by the Stoics, the Stoic philosophers. Friendship, and all these qualities much praised by the Stoics, they have been much better represented by poets in classical literature. And contrarily, the remorse of conscience in Oedipus, the soon repenting pride of Agamemnon, the self-devouring cruelty in his father Atreus, the violence of ambition in the two Theban brothers, the sour sweetness of revenge in Medea, and to fall lower, the Terentian Gnatho and our Chaucer Spander, so expressed that we now use their names to signify their traits. And finally, all virtues, vices and passions, so in their own natural states laid to the view that we seem not to hear of them but clearly to see through them. So he cites a number of examples, Ulysses, Diomedes, Achilles, Nisus, Euryalus, as examples of virtue, and then examples of vice like Atreus, Agamemnon, Oedipus, Medea, Gnatho, Pander, and so on. So he says that they have been figured forth, or they have been picturized, imagined in such a manner by these poets that we still remember them, and whenever we speak of the quality of virtue or vice, we immediately remember these characters. But even in the most excellent determination of goodness, what philosopher's counsel can so readily direct a prince as the famed Cyrus in Xenophon? already Sidney has referred to Xenophon's creation of Cyrus, the Persian emperor, which is an imaginative creation, and Sidney says that it is a much better character created by the poet that people remember. A prince, the ideal example of a prince can be found in Xenophon's description of Cyrus. A virtuous man in all fortunes, as Aeneas in Virgil. So Virgil's character Aeneas in the Aeneid is a man of all virtues, for a whole commonwealth, as the way of Sir Thomas More's Utopia. Sir Thomas More's book Utopia gives us the example of more or less an ideal commonwealth, which Sidney is praising here because he is referring to it, but at the same time he is cautious because Sir Thomas More was executed by Henry VIII and therefore was looked upon as a traitor by the House of Tudor. So Sidney was cautious here. More was looked upon as a martyr by the Roman Catholics. So Sidney, being a Protestant, and he doesn't want to antagonize the ruling monarch, Elizabeth. So he says, I say the way because where Sir Thomas More erred, it was the fault of the man and not of the poet. So Thomas More's mistakes as a man are not to be confused with his work as a writer or a poet. So Sidney praises More highly as a writer, but says or indicates that he is critical of More as a man because More sided with Roman Catholicism and did not side with Protestantism. For that way of patterning a commonwealth was most absolute, though he perchance has not so absolutely performed it. For the question is whether the faint image of poesy or the regular instruction of philosophy had the more force in teaching. So More's imagination of the ideal commonwealth was absolute. Sidney says that is, it could not be improved upon. And on this question, who is a greater or a better teacher, philosopher or poet? Sidney says, wherein if the philosophers have more rightly showed themselves philosophers than the poets have attained to the high top of their profession, as in truth, mediocribus esse poetis non di non homines non concessere columnae. Sidney is quoting from Horace, Horace's Art of Poetry, and these lines mean, but neither men nor gods nor pillars meant poets should ever be indifferent. So should I repeat the meaning? The meaning of these lines is, but neither men nor gods nor pillars meant poets should ever be indifferent. So Sidney's point here is that philosophers highly praise virtues, but do the poets remain indifferent to virtues? Never. So Horace writes that nobody ever said that poets should be indifferent to moral virtues. I say again, not the fault of the art, but that by few men that art can be accomplished. So he is still defending poetry. He says that whatever fault you see in poetry is not the fault of poetry, but particular poets who abuse the art. Therefore, you should not judge poetry to be an art that does not teach moral philosophy. Then he gives the example of Christ, saying that even Christ used to teach morality through parables or stories. So the divine narration of Dives and Lazarus, this narration we find in Luke 16, or of disobedience and mercy as that heavenly discourse of the lost child and the gracious father. The story, the parable of Christ. But that his through searching wisdom knew the estate of Dives burning in hell and of Lazarus being in Abraham's bosom, would more constantly inhabit both the memory and judgment. Truly for myself, meseems I see before mine eyes the lost child's disdainful prodigality turned to envy a swine's dinner. That this story of the lost child is to be found in Luke, which by the learned divines are thought not historical acts but instructing parables. So even Christ uses stories or parables which are not historically true but are works of imagination. Then he comes to the conclusion of this part. I say the philosopher teacheth, but he teacheth obscurely, so as the learned only can understand him. That is to say, he teacheth them that are already taught. But the poet is the food for the tenderest stomachs. The poet is indeed the right popular philosopher, whereof Aesop's tales give good proof. So Sidney is always referring to didactic literature. Aesop's fables always had some moral at the end, whose pretty allegories, stealing under the formal tales of beasts, make many more beastly than beasts begin to hear the sound of virtue from these dumb speakers. So people who are even more beastly than animals, even they are influenced by reading Aesop's fables, and they begin to hear the sound of virtue. In the next, so by here Sidney concludes that the philosopher teaches, but he cannot teach in the same lively manner as that of the poet. And then he goes on to say that the poet also has high philosophical qualities in his teaching. But now may it be alleged that if this imagining of matters to be fit for the imagination, then must the historian needs surpass who bringeth the images of true matters, such as indeed were done, and not such as fantastically or falsely may be suggested to have been done. So if images are things that matter, then one might argue that historians also bring in images, and their images are of real men, real people, and these are not falsifications, unlike poetry. Truly Aristotle himself in his discourse of poesy plainly determineth this question, saying the poetry is philosophoteron and spudaioteron, that is to say, it is more philosophical and more studiously serious than history. So Sidney quotes Aristotle and his Poetics and says that the poet is philosophoteron, that is more philosophical, spudaioteron, more serious. And these are two Greek words, and they have become very, well known after Sidney's use. And I think Matthew Arnold also uses them in his essays. His reason is because poesy dealeth with katholu, that is to say, with the universal consideration, and the history with kathekaston, the particular. So Aristotle's, why Aristotle praises poetry over philosophy and history, that history gives examples of the particular persons or people, but poetry gives examples which are universal. The particular, now say the universal ways what is fit to be said or done, either in likelihood or necessity, and the particular only marks whether Alcibiades did or suffered this or that. Thus for Aristotle, which reason of his is most full of reason? So Aristotle is highly praised as full of reason. Therefore, Sidney provides an authority in Aristotle. This was also a rhetorical practice of citing authorities, which in terms of rhetoric was called testimony. When you cite authorities. Now this is also a practice of lawyers. Lawyers cite past judgments which are pronounced by judges of great merit. So in writing also we use examples of authorities to establish our argument. For indeed, if the question were whether it were better to have a particular act truly or falsely set down, there is no doubt which is to be chosen. So if we are concerned only with a particular fact of history, and the question is asked whether that fact should be truly written down or should be falsified, then everybody knows that the answer is that it should be truly written down. Historical facts should not be falsified. There is no doubt which is to be chosen, no more than whether you had rather have Vespasian's picture right as he was, or at the painter's pleasure, nothing resembling. So this question is as simple as the question, Vespasian was a Roman emperor. I am using the black. Vespasian. Roman from 69 to 79 AD. And many painters, Renaissance painters, painted Vespasian. For example, Titian. A Renaissance painter painted Vespasian and others also. So Sidney must have known about these paintings, and he says that the painter's representation has almost no resemblance to the actual emperor, because as far as I have seen Vespasian's sculptures coming down from the Roman times, he was rather ugly looking, but the Renaissance painters made him much more beautiful. So he says that the question is whether somebody from history should be properly represented or not, truthfully or not. The obvious answer is yes, truthfully. And the painters who painted Vespasian as different from what he was actually, what he looked like, is not truthful. But if the question be for your own use and learning, whether it be better to have it set down as it should be or as it was, then certainly is more doctrinable the faint Cyrus of Xenophon than the true Cyrus in Justine. So, Justine was a Roman historian. Who wrote on the Persian Emperor Cyrus. And Xenophon, we know, was the Greek writer who wrote on Cyrus in his Chiropedia. So we have the historian, we have the poet. So who gives us a better example of Cyrus? Obviously Sidney says that Xenophon's example or representation of Cyrus is much better and should be emulated because it is an idealistic representation. So it represents virtues which should be emulated, but this Justine's representation is historical, and the historical man would not be said to be idle. So Sidney is all praise for Xenophon, and his representation, Sidney says, is more doctrinable, that is more appropriate for teaching. Doctrine is something that you teach. It comes from the Latin verb docere, which means to teach. Or the faint Aeneas in Virgil than the right Aeneas in Dares Phygius. So Virgil's representation of Aeneas is much more ideal for teaching than that by Dares Phygius, the historian. So if the poet do his part right, he will show you in Tantalus, Atreus and such like nothing that is not to be shunned. So these are the examples in mythology which is the source of literature, Greek literature, and mythology is not considered to be historical. Myths are considered to as stories, imaginative stories. So the story of Tantalus and Atreus as characters who were very cruel and or very greedy. Atreus was very cruel, Tantalus was very greedy. So we know that in Greek literature we know that the house of Atreus had a curse upon it, and Atreus, Agamemnon and several generations they suffered because of this curse. All that because of Atreus' greed, and his brother Thyestes. So they all, the brothers, they fought among themselves. Atreus had 3 brothers, and on the subject of these 3 brothers there are many stories. Seneca, for example, has the story of Thyestes, a play named Thyestes, where Atreus invites Thyestes, his brother, and feeds him with the flesh of his own son in a banquet, and so on. So he is the example of a very cruel man. Tantalus was very greedy, so Zeus punished him. He would remain neck deep in water, and with fruit-laden branches of a tree hanging just a short distance from his mouth, such that he would not be able to reach the fruit and eat it, nor he will be able to drink the water. So because of his greed, Tantalus is punished by Zeus in Greek myth. So we still use the word tantalizing to mean something that tempts us but we cannot reach it. Right. So Sidney says that these are great examples in poetry. In Cyrus, Aeneas, Ulysses, each thing to be followed. So examples of evil characters like Atreus, Tantalus, and good characters like Cyrus, Ulysses, and so on, where the historian bound to tell things as things were cannot be liberal of a perfect pattern, but as in Alexander or Scipio himself, show doings, some to be liked, some to be misliked. So historical characters like Alexander or Scipio, Greek and Roman heroes, they are not ideal examples because they have some virtues, but they also have many vices. But if we know an example only informs a conjectured likelihood, and so go by reason, the poet doth so far exceed him, as he is to frame his example to that which is most reasonable, be it in warlike, politic or private matters. So Sidney says a poet is more reasonable in creating a character, whereas a historian is bound to represent his characters realistically or as he was factually, and since men do not always behave rationally, therefore historians cannot represent characters in a reasonable manner. On the other hand, poets represent characters in a reasonable manner. Where the historian in his bare wars hath many times that which we call fortune to overrule the best wisdom. The historian depends on the wars. That is, what was there in history. The historian must represent only that. So he is tied to facts, and therefore he cannot represent something which is universally praiseworthy. Many times he must tell events whereof he can ill no cause, or if he do, it must be poetical. Because heroes in history, they often behave irrationally, like conquering other people's countries. These are irrational conducts, but the historian has to depict them because he is tied to facts and he cannot depict in an idealistic fashion. Therefore, he is tied to what was, and the poet does not have this limitation. Do you have any questions so far? Hello, are you listening? Gargi, Piyasa, anybody? Are you being able to follow?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You have no questions? So, fiction as forceful as truth. The next argument of Sidney is that fiction is also very forceful. For that a feigned example has as much force to teach as a true example. For as for to move, it is clear, since the feigned may be tuned to the highest key of passion. Let us take one example wherein a poet and a historian do concur. Herodotus and Justin do both testify that Zopyrus, King Darius's faithful servant, seeing his master long resisted by the rebellious Babylonians, feigned himself in extreme disgrace of his king, for verifying of which he caused his own nose and ears to be cut off, and so flying to the Babylonians was received and for his known valor so far credited that he did find means to deliver them over to Darius. So the example of this man, the servant of Darius, Zopyrus, who made this plot of convincing the rebellious Babylonians that Darius cut off his ears and nose, and then they were sympathetic to him and he was able to help Darius arrest them. Much like matter doth Livy record of Tarquinius and his son, Xenophon excellently feigned such another stratagem performed by Abradatus in Cyrus's behalf. So the kind of strategy in writing taken by Herodotus the historian and Justin, similar things we see also in writers like Xenophon. Now would I fain know, if occasion be presented unto you, to serve your prince by such an honest dissimulation. So the servant Zopyrus served his king by honest dissimulation. Now can dissimulation be honest? So it is a question of moral philosophy. Dissimulation means cheating. So Zopyrus cheated the Babylonians when he said that his king was cruel to him and cut off his ears and nose, and thereby he was able to convince them. So this was dissimulation, but at the same time it was for an honest purpose because he wanted to serve his king. The question is whether that is acceptable. Now I fain to know, if occasion be presented unto you, to serve your prince by such an honest dissimulation, why you do not as well learn it of Xenophon's fiction as of the other's verity, and truly so much the better. So Sidney is critical of this historical behavior of Zopyrus, which the historians Herodotus and Justin lays down, and he says that such dishonest actions should not be written because they do not teach us anything good. On the other hand, if one reads Xenophon, then there one won't find any such intrigues or deception in Xenophon's writing. Therefore, the poet is much more acceptable than the historian. Okay, according to Sidney. Xenophon's writings are able to convey moral philosophy much better than those of Herodotus and Justin. Then he goes on to talk about the fact that in literature often the evil are punished and the good are rewarded, and this is known as poetic justice. So even though this idea of poetic justice became popular in the 18th century in England, but we see that Sidney is already talking about poetic justice. Later, of course, in modern times, it is not acceptable. The attempt of representing the good always being punished and the virtuous, the good always being rewarded and the evil always being punished. In modern literature, we often see the opposite. That is, we often see that good people suffer and the bad people prosper, because that is what happens in reality. And realism became important much later. So, in the 16th and 17th centuries, still one would emphasize morality over realism. So Sidney talks about poetic justice. Now, to that which commonly is attributed to the praise of histories in respect of the notable learning is gotten by marking the success as though therein a man should see virtue exalted and vice punished. Truly that commendation is peculiar to poetry and far off from history. So, virtue being rewarded and evil or bad deeds being punished, that can be seen more in poetry than in history. For indeed poetry ever setteth virtue so out in her best colours, making fortune her well-waiting handmaid, that one must needs be enamoured of her. Well may you see Ulysses in a storm and in other hard plights, but they are but exercises of patience and magnanimity to make them shine the more in the near falling prosperity. So Sidney's idea is that in poetry we always see that the hero has great virtue and magnanimity, and along with that he also has fortune or good luck. And fortune is like a handmaid of virtue. So, in literature, in poetry, we see that the hero has both virtue and fortune. And even if the hero is represented as suffering, like Ulysses in his voyages, but they are only examination of his virtues, and ultimately they become victorious. But the historian, being captive to the truth of a foolish world, is many times a terror from well-doing and an encouragement to unbridled wickedness. So the world is foolish and irrational, and the historian must represent the world as it is. Therefore, the historian has to represent something foolish. He cannot represent what is the ideal. For we see not See we not valiant Miltiades wrought in his fetters, the just Phocion and the accomplished Socrates put to death like traitors. So, historically, Socrates, who was a great philosopher, he was given the sentence by the state that he should kill himself by having poison. And there are many other such characters in history. Sidney gives some examples and says that these are examples that the bad people are rewarded and the good are punished in history. The cruel Severus lived prosperously, the excellent Severus miserably murdered. So the cruel Severus, that is in history, we have the character Septimius Severus. In Roman history. Who was very cruel, but he lived prosperously. And the excellent Severus is Alexander Severus, who was martyred. Alexander Severus, even though he was an excellent man, he was martyred. See we not Sylla and Marius dying in their beds, Pompey and Cicero slain then, why they would have thought exile as happiness. See we not virtuous Cato driven to kill himself, and rebel Caesar so advanced that his name yet after 1600 years lasted in the highest honor. So the virtuous character Cato, he had to kill himself, and Caesar, even though he was rebellious, yet he has been highly praised in history. And mark but even Caesar's own words of the forenamed Sylla, who in that only did honestly to put down his dishonest tyranny, literus nescivit, that is, he was ignorant of letters, as if want of learning caused him to do well. Caesar, in his writings, said that Sylla, a Roman character, did well because he did not, he was ignorant of letters. Literus nescivit means ignorant of letters. So it suggests that if somebody is ignorant of letters, then he would succeed. But one who is learned may not succeed. He meant it not by poetry, which, not content with earthly plagues, devises new punishments in hell for tyrants, nor yet by philosophy, which teacheth Occidendo's essay, but no doubt by skill in history, for that indeed can afford your Cypselus, Periander, Valeris, Dionysius, that skilled well enough in their abominable injustice or usurpation. So, Caesar here is not referring to poetry, because in poetry the evil people are depicted as being punished in hell, or he is not referring to philosophy, because philosophy teaches Occidendo's essay, that is, if you are a good man and yet you suffer, then you get yourself killed. Occidento's essay means to get yourself killed. Because I think it is an insinuation of committing suicide. The Roman philosophers, they often suggested that one should commit suicide if one finds that one is having a miserable life in spite of being virtuous. And Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, committed suicide. So, Caesar is not referring to poetry or to philosophy, but in history, because in history we see that many characters who were evil, and Sidney gives 4 names: Ipselus, Periander, Phalaris and Dionysius. These were Roman emperors who persecuted people, and they succeeded in life in their acts of usurpation. So history shows us that evil people do well, whereas virtuous people, they often suffer or they commit suicide and so on. Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let me know if you do not understand it. I conclude therefore. So another conclusion of this part, and this is very significant because he says that the purpose of poetry is to move people, move them towards emulating ideal characters and inculcating virtues. I conclude therefore that he excelled history, that means the poet excels history not only in furnishing the mind with knowledge, but in setting it forward to that which deserves to be called and accounted good. So both knowledge and good, which setting forward and moving to well-doing, indeed setteth the laurel crown upon the poet as victorious, not only of the historian but over the philosopher, howsoever in teaching it may be questionable. So what is Sidney's conclusion after this long comparison with history and philosophy? That the poet wins the crown, the poet wins the laurel. He is victorious over history and philosophy. Why? Because he furnishes the mind with knowledge, and projects that which is good, that is the teaching of virtue. And moves people, to well-doing, that is virtuous practice. Virtuous practice. Just a second. So his conclusion is that the poet furnishes the mind with knowledge, presents the representation of goodness or virtue, and moves people to virtuous practice. And therefore, in all this, he excels the historian and the philosopher. For suppose it be granted that which I suppose with great reason may be denied, that the philosopher in respect of his methodical proceeding doth teach more perfectly than the poet, yet do I think that no man is so much philosophos as to compare the philosopher in moving with the poet. He says that let us assume that the philosopher teaches better than the poet, which is very unlikely. So he proposes something and cancels it at the same breath. So let us assume that the philosopher teaches better than the poet. But nobody loves a philosopher so much that one would argue that the philosopher moves better than a poet. Because poets are well known for their power of moving. It is moving somebody with emotions, passions. He uses the term philosophos, that is, lover of philosopher. Lover of philosopher. So he said that nobody can be so blind a lover of a philosopher that he would say that a philosopher moves better than a poet. Therefore, Sidney's argument is that a poet excels in moving people, which even the philosopher cannot do. And therefore, a poet is a better teacher than a philosopher or a historian. So you see how much Sidney's argument depends on this idea of moving, which I told you was the contribution of the rhetorician Agricola. That one of the tasks of poetry is moving. And that moving is of a higher degree than teaching, it may by this appear that it is well nigh the cause and the effect of teaching. So moving is of a higher degree than teaching. Why? Because it is both a cause and effect of teaching. So if the poet teaches one well, then he will be moved. Therefore, moving is an effect. And if the poet moves one well, then he will be taught, because he will learn what the poet is trying to teach. For who will be taught if he be not moved with desire to be taught? So in order to be taught, first of all, one must have the will or the desire to be taught. And for that one has to be moved. And what so much good doth that teaching bring forth, as that it moveth one to do that which it doth teach. So, education which moves one to practice virtue, only that education is meaningful. So Sidney emphasizes on praxis. That is, a mere discourse of virtue, as in philosophy, is not sufficient. But virtue must be practiced in life, and a poet teaches the praxis of virtue by giving great examples. And in this, Sidney is influenced by the French logician, I already told you, Peter Remus, who theorized the importance of praxis. But of course, Sidney does not mention Remus because Remus was a contemporary, so he mentions Aristotle. For as Aristotle said, it is not gnosis but praxis must be the fruit. So gnosis means knowledge and praxis means practice. So even Aristotle emphasizes practice. And practice, Aristotle says, is the fruit or the result of teaching, not knowledge. And how praxis can be without being moved to practice, it is no hard matter to consider. So, first of all, one must be moved. So, to be moved means also to be persuaded. So, unless one is persuaded to practice virtue, how will one practice virtue? Therefore, the purpose of teaching is to move or persuade somebody to practice virtue. So he goes on to say that the philosopher shows you the way, informs you of the particularities and the tediousness of the way or the pleasant lodging in your journey. In other words, the philosopher tells one about all the pros and cons of practicing any virtue. But he cannot move one, cannot persuade one to practice virtue. And that is the greatest labor. Sidney is quoting from Virgil. But to be moved to do that which we know, or to be moved with desire to know, hoc opus, hic labor est. This Latin phrase means, this is toil, this is labor. This is toil, this is labor. This is toil, this is labor. This is quoted from Virgil's The Aeneid. Now therein of all sciences I speak still of human, and not and according to the human conceit, is our poet the monarch. So science for Sidney means discipline. So in among all disciplines, and immediately he modifies the statement by saying that I am talking only about human disciplines, which he said at the very beginning that I have set apart divine discipline, that is theology or any such divine discipline. But among human disciplines, poetry is the monarch. For he doth not only show the way, but giveth so sweet a prospect into the way as will entice any man to enter into it. So he just said that the philosopher also shows the way, but philosopher cannot show this sweet prospect which a poet can show. That is, he makes this way attractive and charming, so that one is persuaded to walk on this path. Nay, he doth as if your journey should lie through a fair vineyard, at the first give you a cluster of grapes, that full of that taste you may long to pass farther. He beginneth not with obscure definitions which must blur the margin with interpretations. So, the writing of interpretations or gloss, commentary on the margins of a book was an ancient practice which we still do. So, when you read a book of philosophy, there are so many interpretations. which tend to confuse one about the true meaning of the philosopher. Because the philosopher deals with obscure or difficult definitions. Of course, when Sidney talks about philosophy, he has in mind scholastic philosophy. And the scholastic philosophers of the Middle Ages, particularly there were many English philosophers like Duns Scotus and others. They were notorious for their obscurity or difficulty. Sidney, being a humanist, he did not like the obscurity of the scholastics. The poet does not begin with such obscure definitions and load the memory with doubtfulness. That is what the scholastics do. But he cometh to you with words set in delightful proportion, either accompanied with or prepared for the well-enchanting skill of music. So the poet also uses music or versification, meter, which is nothing but a skill of proportion. And with a tale, forsooth, he cometh unto you, with a tale which holdeth children from play and old men from the chimney corner. Now, this sentence has become famous, that the poet comes with a tale, that is, a story which is so attractive that it stops children from playing and old men from going to the side of the fire. So the poet's tale or story captivates people. They are captured, they are mesmerized. Next, Sidney goes on to say that poetic imitation is delightful. That imitation, whereof poetry is, hath the most conveniency to nature of all other, insomuch that, as Aristotle said, those things which in themselves are horrible, as cruel battles, unnatural monsters, are made in poetical imitation delightful. So even the horrible or cruel things, when we read them in literature or poetry, we are delighted, that is, we are entertained. So the point here is that poetry is delightful, and this is important. This entertainment factor is important because poetry teaches us by entertaining us. Truly I have known men that even with reading Amadis the Gaul, which God knoweth wanted much of a perfect poesy, have found their hearts moved to the exercise of courtesy, liberality, and especially courage. So he is referring to a Spanish romance. And he says that romance was a long poetry written in the Middle Ages. So Amadis the Gaul was a Spanish romance, a popular romance. And he says that it is not perfect poetry, there are many defects, but still it is delightful and it teaches courtesy, liberality and courage. Who reads Aeneas carrying old Anchises on his back, that wisheth not it were his fortune to perform so excellent an act? So Aeneas carrying old Anchises on his back is an example of a virtuous charitable action. So people would love to emulate such a virtuous action. Whom do not the words of Turnus move, the tale of Turnus having planted his image in the imagination? The story of Turnus is found in the Aeneid. Turnus had killed Aeneas' dear friend, and so Aeneas, being angry, he killed Turnus. However, Turnus had requested Aeneas before the fight. Turnus was persuaded by his friends and relatives not to face Aeneas, but he fought Aeneas because of honor, for the sake of honor. And before the fight, he had requested Aeneas to return his dead body to his father if he died. Aeneas did not listen to this request or respond to it, but he straightforward killed him. Therefore, Turnus here is the hero of a story full of pathos and virtue, because he agreed to fight Aeneas for the sake of honor. So the image of Turnus will be imprinted on the mind of the reader. Fugientem hec terra videbit, usque adione mori miserum est. The meaning of these lines is, shall this land see him flying hence? In such a plight is death so hard to bear? This is from Aeneid, book 13. So I am repeating the English translation of the lines. Shall this land see him flying hence? In such a plight is death so hard to bear? It is from book 13 of the Aeneid. But the philosophers, as they scorn to delight, so must they be content little to move, saving wrangling whether virtue be the chief or the only good, whether the contemplative or the active life do excel. So philosophers refuse to move, they refuse to delight or entertain people, but they present wrangling or disputes on questions of virtue, like which one is preferable, active life or contemplative life. I have already told you about that. In the Renaissance also it was very well known, the debate between vita activa and vita contemplativa. So Sidney's point is that people are not moved by such disputes. Therefore, the philosopher cannot teach well. Plato and Boethius well knew, and therefore made mistress philosophy very often borrow the masking raiment of poesy. So even though Plato had banished poetry from the ideal republic, but he himself wrote in the manner of a poet. And similarly, the Roman philosopher Boethius, they disguised philosophy in the clothes of poetry. Raiment means clothes. For even those hard-hearted evil men who think virtue a school name and no other good but indulgere genio, and therefore despise the austere admonitions of the philosopher, and feel not the inward reason they stand upon, yet will be content to be delighted, which is all the good fellow poet seemeth to promise, and so still to see the form of goodness, which sin they cannot but love, yet themselves be aware, as if they took a medicine of cherries. So Sidney says, the hard-hearted evil man who only follows his instinct. Indulgere genio means follow your own devices. In other words, these men are selfish. So the hard-hearted evil men, they will not listen to the dry discussion of the philosophers. To them, virtue is only a school name. It is something to be hard in schools. So they are not interested in virtue, but they want to be delighted, and therefore they would read poetry, and when they read about the virtuous action of the characters in poetry, since they are entertained, they are delighted, so unknowingly they would like to fall in love with virtue. Therefore, poetry is able to teach virtue even to the hard-hearted evil men. Then Sidney says that poetry can persuade us through parables. Poetry uses parables, and he gives two examples. The one of Menenius Agrippa, who, when the whole people of Rome had resolutely divided themselves from the Senate with apparent show of utter ruin, though he were an excellent orator, came not among them upon trust either of figurative speeches or cunning insinuations, and much less with far-fetched maxims of philosophy, but with a story, like a homely and familiar poet. So when the people had revolted against the authority in Rome, then Menenius Agrippa told them a story. And this story is about the mutiny of the body against the belly, which they thought devoured the fruits of each other's labor. So all parts of the body rebelled against the stomach or the belly, because the stomach ate up the food which was the result of hard labor by other parts of the body. They concluded they would let so unprofitable a spender starve. In the end, to be short, with punishing the belly, they plagued themselves. So they decided that they would make the belly starve. But as they punished the belly, then they themselves were also starved. So we know that if the stomach does not receive food, then other parts of the body cannot receive nourishment. This applied by him wrought such effect in the people as I never read that ever words brought forth but then so certain and so good an alteration. So Menenius Agrippa told this story, which is a parable. So just as the belly must be given food so that other parts of the body can be nourished, similarly the state authorities, the Senate, they must be given their power, their wealth, so that the rest of the Commonwealth or the rest of the people can have a fruitful life. So the first example is that by Menenius Agrippa of a parable. The second example is that of Nathan the prophet, and this is from the Bible. When the holy David had so far forsaken God as to confirm adultery with murder, when he was to do the tenderest office of a friend in laying his own shame before his eyes, sent by God to call again so chosen a servant, how doth he it but by telling of a man whose beloved lamb was ungratefully taken from his bosom? So Nathan told David, who was the ruler and who had become corrupt and adultery and murder and all these things, committed these things. Then Nathan, as his friend, made him see his folly or his mistake by telling him the story of a man whose beloved lamb was taken from his bosom. The application most divinely true, but the discourse itself faint, which made David, as in a glass, to see his own filthiness, as that heavenly psalm of mercy will testify. So Nathan says that just as the beloved lamb of a person is taken away from his bosom, similarly David, who was beloved of God, he would be taken away from God because of his corruption, and David could realize his mistakes. So Sidney gives the examples of these two parables, and then comes to the conclusion that poetry is supreme as an incentive to virtue. Right. Then we will have virtuous kinds of poetry depended separately. So far Sidney elaborated this argument that poetry is superior to history and philosophy, and then concluded this argument by saying that poetry can move even the hard-hearted men, evil men, and then he says that poetry teaches through parables, and he gives two examples, and therefore he has established the efficacy of poetry or the superiority of poetry in the matter of teaching virtue. And then he enters into this part of his discourse where he examines or scrutinizes different kinds of poetry, different genres of poetry, one after another. So he says that I have discussed the whole, and now I will discuss the parts. So this was the logical way of any discussion in the according to the rhetorical fashion, that first there should be a generalized or universal discussion of the whole art, and then, or any topic, and then a discussion of its parts. So now he comes to the parts of poetry. So that as in a man, though altogether may carry a presence full of majesty and beauty, perchance in someone defectious piece we may find a blemish. Now in parts, kinds or species, it is to be noted that some poeses have coupled together 2 or 3 kinds. So Sidney says that just as when we look at a man as a whole, then we tend to overlook any blemish in him. But if we examine the parts, then we look at everything much more closely, and then we can see the defects. So he comes to discuss one after another the different parts of poetry. So he says that these days we find some mixing of genres, like the different kinds of poetry as tragical and comical, which are combined together as in tragicomedy. Some in the like manner have mingled prose and verse, as Sannazaro and Boethius. Now, tragicomedy, it appears that Sidney is adverse to the idea of tragicomedy. It was a genre recently developed in Italy, and in England, tragicomedies were not written, though Shakespeare closely kind of followed it in the Winter's Tale, in his play Winter's Tale. But actually, the kind of tragicomedy which was written in Italy, in England we do not see that. So Sidney is critical of tragicomedy. At some place he says that mongrel tragicomedy. So tragicomedy is like a mixed breed, and he does not support it. Similarly, mixing of prose and poetry, he speaks about Sannazaro and Boethius. Now, he does not or is not critical of this practice, the practice of mixing poetry or verse with prose. Sannazaro was the famous Italian writer of the romance Arcadia, and Sidney himself wrote a romance in imitation of Sannazaro, also named Arcadia, where we find that he combines verse with prose, and therefore we may imagine that he is not critical of this practice. Some have mingled matters heroical and pastoral, but that cometh all to one in this question, for if severed they be good, the conjunction cannot be heartful. That is, if they are good when separated, then how can they be bad when they are united? So, mixing of things may not always be bad. Therefore, perchance forgetting some and leaving some as needless to be remembered, it shall not be amiss in a word to cite the special kinds to see what faults may be found in the right use of them. So, he examines closely some of these poems. Now he says that let us see which kind of poem is bad or misliked. Is it then the pastoral poem which is misliked? Because here the characters in pastoral poem are low. So maybe people do not find pastoral poems to be as didactic as other kinds of poetry. Is the poor pipe disdained, which sometimes out of Meliboeus' mouth can show the misery of people under hard lords or ravening soldiers? So Meliboeus was the writer of pastoral, or a character, I think, not a writer, character in Virgil. So Sidney actually here is alluding to Virgil's Eclogues, which was the most famous Roman model of pastoral. And in Eclogues, Melibus, Tityrus, these are the shepherds. Who are depicted, who play the pipe and sing simple songs. Sometimes under the pretty tales of wolves and sheep can include the whole considerations of wrongdoing and patience. Sometimes show that contention for trifles can get but a trifling victory. Where perchance a man may see that even Alexander and Darius, when they strave who should be cock of this world's dunghill, the benefit they got was that the afterlivers may say, Hec memini et victum frustra contenderethissim, ex illo corridon est tempore nobis. So here Sidney is talking about the virtue of pastoral poetry. The meaning of these Latin lines is, these rhymes I did to memory commend, when vanquished Thyrsis did in vain contend, since when his Corydon among the swains, young Corydon without a rival reigns. Dryden's translation. So these lines are from the Eclogues, and Sidney says that unlike the heroic stories of Alexander Darius, sometimes these simple pastoral poems also have a lot to teach. Perhaps I should write the translation. These rhymes I did to memory commend, when vanquished Thyrsis did in vain contend. I am not writing, you may take down, I am saying. These rhymes I did to memory commend, when vanquished Thyrsis did in vain contend, since when his Corydon among the swains, young Corydon without rival reigns. So Corydon was the shepherd character in the Eclogues. Who is represented as a virtuous ruler among the shepherds, unlike Thyrsis. Is it the lamenting elegiac? So after examining pastoral, Sidney says, is it the elegiac which in a kind heart would move rather pity than blame, who bewails with the great philosophers Heraclitus the weakness of mankind and the wretchedness of the world? So Heraclitus of Ephesus was known as the weeping philosopher. So we have a weeping philosopher and we have a laughing philosopher. The weeping. So Sidney says that elegiac poetry which evokes pity should that be praised? who surely is to be praised either for compassionate accompanying just causes of lamentation or for rightly painting out how weak be the passions of woefulness. So, elegiac poetry represents the passion and lamentation and weakness of sorrow. He is the bitter but wholesome iambic. So, elegiac poetry, Sidney says that, is also beneficial because it teaches that passions are representation or signs of weakness. Is it the bitter but wholesome iambic which rubs the galled mind in making shame of the trumpet of villainy with bold and open crying out against naughtiness? Iambic poetry or satiric poetry. So Sidney examines the different kinds of poetry one after another, and he says the satiric who omne vapor vitium ridenti tangit amico. I mean, it is a quotation from Perseus's satires. It means there are two lines from Perseus. Omne vapor vitium ridenti flaccus amico tangit et admissus circum precordia ludit. Flaccus means Horace. Flaccus the rascal probes every fault of his friend while making him laugh, and once inside he plays with the secrets of his heart. These lines of Perseus were very often quoted by Renaissance writers. So the meaning of these two lines is that even a friend may write a satirical poem about somebody and show all the weaknesses of his character through laughter. So satire tends to correct somebody or teach somebody to get rid of his vices through laughter. Now this famous phrase, circum cordia ludit, secrets of his heart, that is plays around his heart. That is also quoted by Francis Bacon, who sportingly never liveth until he make a man laugh at folly, and at length ashamed to laugh at himself, which he cannot avoid without avoiding the folly. Who while circum precordia ludit giveth us to feel how many headaches a passionate life bringeth us to. So satire teaches us how passion leads us to, when all is done, est ulubris animus sinos non deficit icus. This is a quotation from Horace's Epistles. Even in the unpleasant town of Ulubri, happiness may be found if we have calm and equable mind. If you want, you can write it down. I am reading slowly. Even in the unpleasant town of Ulubri, Brae, happiness may be found if we have calm and equable mind. So these Latin lines that Sidney is quoting, they were very famous and quoted by many people in the Renaissance. So these lines are from Horace's Epistles. So we'll stop here. If you have any questions, you can ask. Did you see the...
No, sir.
Okay, did you see the board? Horace's Epistles. Alright. Horace's Epistles, from which we have these lines. So Sidney examined one after another elegiac, satiric, pastoral, the different genres, and he continues in this fashion, and he finds all of them useful. So his strategy here is to establish by examining the parts of poetry that no part of poetry is useless. So poetry is useful, which he establishes by making a general discussion of poetry as well as by talking about the different parts of poetry, with the different genres of poetry. Alright then, we will continue in the next class.